The coffee was already cold by the time Harper Doyle set it on the desk, because she had learned 4 years ago that Suho Cho did not want it hot. He wanted it exactly the temperature of a room that had gone still, and she had learned to read every version of his silence the way other people read a face. She set the cup down without a sound, aligned the handle to the right the way he liked it, and stepped back before he even looked up from the contract he was reading. That was her job. Not the coffee. The reading of him. For years of standing 2 feet from the most dangerous man in the Los Angeles Koreatown corridor had taught her that his stillness was a language, and she had become fluent in it whether she wanted to be or not. "You rearranged my afternoon," Suho said, not a question, his eyes still on the page. "Councilman Fian moved his flight," Harper said. "I moved you instead of losing the meeting." He looked up then, just for a moment, dark eyes finding hers with the particular directness that made junior soldiers in his organization stammer and made rival bosses choose their words with excessive care. Harper had never stammered in front of him, not once in 4 years, and she suspected that was part of why he trusted her the way he did. A trust so complete, he had once said, in one of the rare, unguarded moments she still turned over at night, that she was the only person in his empire who had never once lied to him about anything, even small things. "Good," he said, and went back to the contract, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough to keep Harper's pulse elevated for the better part of an hour, because that was the shape her love for him had taken over for years, small and starved and entirely private, fed on nothing but the crumbs of his approval and the accident of proximity. She had never told him. She had never told anyone. Harper Doyle was 23 years old, sharp enough to run the daily operations of a criminal empire from behind a desk that officially did not exist, and disciplined enough to have buried a feeling so deep that most days she almost believed it was gone. Almost. It surfaced anyway. In the 2 seconds his hand brushed hers passing a folder, in the low register his voice dropped to when he was truly angry and not merely performing anger for an audience. In the particular way he said her name, Harper, not Ms. Doyle. Not just you, but her actual name, spoken like it belonged to him a little. That was the moment everything changed, though she would not understand it as the beginning of anything until much later, when the office door opened without a knock and Suho's uncle, Deputy Director Han, walked in with 2 men Harper did not recognize and an expression on his face that made the temperature of the room drop before anyone said a word. "Suho," Han said. "We need to discuss the wedding." Harper kept her hands steady on the folder she was holding. She had heard rumors for 3 weeks. Whispers passed between the soldiers who thought she could not hear them from her desk outside his office, that an arrangement was being finalized with the Choi family, that Suho's marriage would consolidate 2 territories that had circled each other warily for a decade, that the bride was young, beautiful, and already being called, in the hushed reverent tone reserved for women who mattered, Yuna Choi. Suho did not look at Harper when he answered his uncle. "It's finalized," he said. "Yuna arrives Friday to begin the formal introductions." Harper set the folder on the desk with hands that did not shake, excused herself with a voice that did not crack, and walked out of the office and down the hallway to the small kitchen where the coffee machine lived, and only there, with the door mostly closed and the sound of the machine grinding beans loud enough to cover anything, did she allow herself 30 seconds to feel the floor drop out from under a life she had built entirely around a man who had never once, not in 4 years, given her any reason to believe this outcome was avoidable. She had known, of course. A woman like her did not survive 4 years inside an organization like Suho Cho's without understanding precisely what she was and was not allowed to become to him. She was invaluable. She was trusted. She was, by every metric that mattered inside those walls, indispensable. She was also, by the only metric that had ever mattered to men like him, not the kind of woman his world had built a place for at his side in public, and she had told herself that reality so many times over 4 years that she had genuinely believed she'd made peace with it. She had not made peace with it. She understood that now, standing alone in the kitchen with her hands flat on the counter, breathing through something that felt uncomfortably close to grief. By Friday, Harper had rebuilt her composure into something functional enough to do her job, and she stood at the edge of the private dining room where Suho's inner circle had gathered to receive Yuna Choi for the first time, and she watched the woman walk in on the arm of her father, and she understood immediately why the soldiers whispered the way they did. Yuna was beautiful in the effortless, engineered way of women raised for exactly this purpose, her dress a deep red that caught the light without trying, her smile calibrated perfectly to land as warm without ever quite reaching her eyes. She moved through the room greeting people with practiced grace, and when she reached Harper, her eyes flicked once, quick and assessing, over Harper's body in a way that was gone so fast most people would have missed it, but Harper did not miss things like that. It was, after all, her job not to. "You must be the assistant," Yuna said, her tone pleasant, her eyes not. "Suho speaks of you sometimes. Says you're very thorough." "I try to be," Harper said. "I'm sure you'll be very useful to me too, once I understand how things run here," Yuna said and smiled again, and moved on to the next introduction, and Harper stood there for a long moment feeling something she could not immediately name. Not jealousy exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but something colder and more specific, a professional instinct sharpened over 4 years of reading rooms for danger, telling her that the smile had not matched the eyes, and that the eyes had been doing something else entirely, something that looked, if Harper was being honest with the part of herself that never lied even when it would have been easier, like calculation. She would think about that later, that first read of Yuna Choi, and she would wonder how much earlier she might have caught what was coming if she had trusted her own instinct instead of telling herself it was jealousy, wearing a more respectable disguise. The weeks that followed the introduction dinner moved with the strange doubled rhythm of an organization preparing for both a wedding and a war, because the Choi alliance had not gone unnoticed by the rivals who had spent a decade waiting for exactly this kind of opening, a moment of transition when an empire's attention split between celebration and vigilance. Harper's workload doubled as security details multiplied and travel plans required constant revision, and threats that used to arrive twice a month began arriving twice a week, coded messages and intercepted communications that Suho reviewed with the same flat, unreadable calm he brought to everything, though Harper, who had spent 4 years learning the specific grammar of his tension, could see it building beneath the surface, like pressure under ice. It was during one of those late nights, the office empty except for the two of them, papers spread across his desk in the particular chaos that meant he had stopped performing control and started actually working, that he said something he had never said before. "My brother trusted the wrong man once," Suho said, not looking up from the file in front of him. "Told him things that got people killed. Family things." He was quiet a moment. "I don't make that mistake. I don't trust people. I evaluate them, and I use what's useful, and I discard what isn't." Harper stood very still by the window, unsure whether he wanted an answer or was simply thinking aloud in the particular way exhausted men sometimes did in rooms they believed were private. "Then why do you trust me?" she asked, before she could stop herself. He looked up at that, and for a long moment he said nothing, and the silence in that office was not empty, it was heavy with something Harper did not have a name for yet. "Because you've never once told me what I wanted to hear," he said finally. "You tell me what's true. Nobody else in this building does that. Nobody else in my life does that." He looked back down at the file. "Don't start now." She did not know, in that moment, that she had just been given the single most honest thing Suho chose. They were leaving a meeting at a restaurant in the corridor's northern edge, Suho a half step ahead of her as they crossed the parking structure toward the car, when the first shot cracked off the concrete pillar 6 inches from his head, and Harper did not think. She moved, grabbing the back of his jacket and pulling him hard behind the pillar as a second shot sparked off the metal where he had been standing a half-second before. His bodyguards returned fire immediately, the parking structure filling with noise that seemed to physically press against Harper's chest, and Suho had a gun in his hand that she had never seen him draw, moving with a precision that looked less like violence and more like something rehearsed 1,000 times, economical and utterly without panic. And Harper flattened herself against the pillar beside him with her heart slamming against her ribs and her ears ringing, and every instinct in her body screaming to run, and she did not run. "Stay down," Suho said, low, close enough that she felt his breath against her ear. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and meant it in ways that went far beyond the parking structure. The exchange lasted less than a minute before the shooters retreated, tires screaming somewhere beyond the structure's lower level, and in the sudden ringing silence that followed, Suho turned to check on her with an urgency that startled her, his hands finding her shoulders, checking her for injury with a thoroughness that had nothing professional left in it. "I'm fine," Harper said. "I'm fine, so." He said her name back to her then, just once, low and rough, Harper, in a voice she had never heard him use before, stripped of every performance he usually wore like armor, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved, his hands still on her shoulders, the parking structure's fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the smell of gunpowder and concrete dust hanging in the air between them, and Harper understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the gunfire had, that whatever this was between them had just become something neither of them could pretend not to see anymore. He dropped his hands first, stepped back, straightened his jacket, and the mask came back down over his face, so completely that Harper almost doubted the moment had happened at all, except that she could still feel the ghost of his hands on her shoulders for hours afterward, and she suspected, watching the careful distance he kept from her for the rest of that night, that he could still feel it too. The investigation into the shooting consumed the following week, soldiers combing through every possible lead, and Harper found herself pulled into the center of it in a way that went beyond her usual duties, because her instinct for reading rooms had made her useful in ways that went beyond scheduling and correspondence. It was during that week, cross-referencing security logs against the guest list from the introduction dinner, that she found the inconsistency that would not leave her alone. Yoona Choi's travel documentation from the week of the shooting placed her in Seoul, attending a family obligation that had kept her away from Los Angeles entirely, verified by 3 separate sources. Except Harper had personally coordinated a floral delivery to Yoona's Los Angeles residence during that exact window, confirmed by a delivery signature that could not have come from Seoul. The discrepancy was small, the kind of thing that meant nothing on its own, easily explained by an assistant or a family member signing on Yoona's behalf. But Harper had spent 4 years training herself to notice small things, and small things, in her experience, were rarely as innocent as they wanted to look. She did not go to Suho immediately. She told herself it was because she needed more than a signature discrepancy before accusing his fiancé of anything, but if she was honest with the part of herself that never lied, she knew some of the delay came from somewhere less noble, a reluctance to be the one who handed him proof that his choice had been a mistake, when some small starved part of her had spent weeks quietly hoping it might turn out to be exactly that. She would think about that hesitation later and what it cost. The morning the second attempt came, it came from inside the building, and it came for Harper specifically, not Suho, which was the detail that told her, even as it was happening, that her instinct about the delivery signature had been right all along, and that someone had realized she was close enough to the truth to become a liability that needed removing before she could speak. She was alone in the archive room on the building's 3rd floor, pulling old security logs to cross-reference against Yoona's documented movements over the past 6 months, when the door opened behind her and a man she recognized as part of the new security detail Yoona had personally requested stepped inside and closed it behind him with a quiet click that made every hair on Harper's arms rise before he said a single word. "You've been asking questions," he said. Harper did not waste time pretending she did not understand him. 4 years in this building had taught her that confusion was a luxury she could not afford in a moment like this. "About a floral delivery," she said, keeping her voice level, already calculating the distance to the door, the distance to the desk, the heavy paperweight sitting 6 inches from her right hand. "Strange thing to kill someone over." "Not the delivery," the man said, moving closer, his hand drifting toward his jacket in a gesture Harper recognized instantly for what it was. "The pattern. You've cross-referenced 11 different dates. You're not looking for a delivery mistake anymore. You're building a timeline." Harper's hand closed around the paperweight before she had fully decided to move, and when he lunged, she swung it hard into the side of his head with every ounce of force 4 years of controlled fear could produce, and he staggered, and she did not wait to see if he recovered. She was already moving past him toward the door, shouting for security in a voice that came out steadier than she felt. And by the time Suho's men arrived, the intruder was unconscious on the floor, and Harper was standing over him with the paperweight still in her hand and blood she did not remember drawing on her knuckles. Suho arrived within minutes, and the look on his face when he saw her standing there, alive, armed with nothing but a paperweight and her own refusal to be a victim, was one Harper would carry with her for the rest of her life. Something raw and unguarded, and entirely without the calculation he brought to every other moment of his existence. "He works for Yuna's security detail," Harper said, before Suho could ask, her voice finally beginning to shake now that the danger had passed, and there was room for the shaking to arrive. "I found a discrepancy in her travel records the week of the shooting in the parking structure. I think she was here, Suho. I think she was here and she wasn't supposed to be, and I think whoever she really works for wanted her here for exactly what happened that night." Suho's face did not change, but something in his stillness shifted into a different register entirely, the specific quiet that Harper had learned over 4 years to recognize as the most dangerous version of him, the one that arrived right before he made a decision that would not be reversed. "Show me everything," he said. What Harper showed him, over the following hours, was a pattern too precise to be coincidence. Yuna's documented absences overlapping with a string of security failures and information leaks that stretched back months before the engagement was ever announced, a pattern that painted a picture Harper had not wanted to see clearly until she had no choice, that the Choi alliance had never been a peace offering at all, that Yuna Choi was not merely the daughter of an allied family, but an operative, embedded by a rival faction that had spent over a year maneuvering her into the one position that would grant total access to Suho's empire from the inside, a position secured not through force, but through the oldest weapon in the world, a beautiful woman offered at exactly the moment an empire's guard would be lowered enough to let her in. Suho listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Harper finished, he sat in silence for a long moment that stretched taut enough to hurt. "I need to be certain," he said finally. "Before I act, I need to be absolutely certain, because if I am wrong about this, the alliance collapses and we go to war with the Choi family over an accusation instead of a truth. Can you get me certain, Harper?" "Yes," Harper said and meant it, though she did not yet know what certainty would cost her. Getting certain meant Harper doing something she would spend a long time afterward deciding whether to regret, slipping into Yuna's private residence during a scheduled fitting appointment that Harper herself had arranged specifically to create the window, searching a bedroom that was not hers to search, finding, inside a jewelry box with a false bottom that took her 20 careful minutes to locate, a satellite communication device that had no business existing inside the home of a woman preparing for a legitimate wedding. Harper photographed everything, replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, and left the residence with her heart hammering and a certainty settling cold and absolute in her chest that she had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, not merely the line of breaking into another person's home, but the line of choosing, decisively and with full knowledge of the consequences, to be the instrument that destroyed Suho's engagement rather than simply the messenger who reported a suspicion. She brought the photographs to Suho that night, and she told him everything, including how she had obtained them, and she watched him go very still as he studied the images on her phone, and when he finally looked up at her, his expression was not gratitude, not yet, it was something more complicated, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he was seeing her clearly for the first time in 4 years despite having looked at her every single day. "You broke into her residence," he said. "Yes. Alone. Without telling me first. Without backup. You needed certainty," Harper said. "I got you certainty." Suho set the phone down on his desk very carefully, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped into the register she had heard only once before, in the parking structure, stripped bare of every performance. "You could have been killed," he said. "You understand that. If her people had caught you in that house, you would not have walked out of it." "I understood that going in," Harper said. "I did it anyway." "Why?" Suho asked, and it was not a rhetorical question, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Why would you take a risk like that for me?" Harper had spent 4 years perfecting the art of never answering that particular question honestly, and she found, standing in his office with evidence of a betrayal spread between them, that she no longer had the strength to keep lying, not to him, not to herself. "Because I've never once told you what you wanted to hear," she said, echoing his own words back to him, her voice steadier than she felt. And the truth is I would take a risk like that for you whether you married her or not. Whether you ever looked at me the way you're looking at me right now or not, because I have loved you for 4 years, Suho. Quietly and stupidly and completely, and I was never going to tell you. And I'm only telling you now because I'd rather you know it and reject it than let you marry a woman who's been lying to your face since the day you met her while I say nothing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the loudest thing Harper had ever experienced, and she stood inside it and did not look away from him, because whatever came next, she had decided somewhere in that jewelry box's false bottom that she was done disappearing into the safety of never being seen. Suho crossed the space between them before she finished processing that he had moved at all, and when he kissed her it was not gentle. It was the kiss of a man who had spent 4 years disciplining himself out of exactly this, and had finally run out of discipline. One hand cradling the back of her head, and the other pulling her against him with a certainty that left no room for either of them to pretend afterward that it had been an accident, and Harper kissed him back with 4 years of starved feeling finally given somewhere to go, and when they broke apart he rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard, and said her name again, Harper, low and rough, and this time she understood exactly what it meant. I told myself staying close to you was just good management, he said quietly. I was lying to myself. I've been lying to myself for longer than I want to admit. They did not have long to sit inside that moment, because the confirmation of Yuna's identity set off a chain of events that could not be slowed once it began. The rival faction realizing their operative had been discovered and accelerating their timeline before Suho could move against them, and the confrontation came 3 nights later at the estate where the wedding rehearsal dinner had been scheduled to take place. A location Yuna's true employers had selected months earlier, Harper now understood, precisely because its layout gave them every tactical advantage should their plan ever need to shift from infiltration to extraction under fire. Harper was not supposed to be there. Suho had asked her, in the closest thing to pleading she had ever heard from him, to stay away from the estate entirely and let his soldiers handle what was coming, and Harper had agreed, and then she had gotten into a car 20 minutes after his convoy left, and followed anyway, because 4 years of loving a man from a careful professional distance had taught her exactly nothing about how to sit safely at home while he walked into danger alone. She arrived at the estate to find the rehearsal dinner already unraveling into violence. Yuna's security detail, revealed now as her true operatives, moving through the property with weapons drawn as Suho's soldiers scrambled to counter an attack that had come faster and harder than anyone had prepared for, and Harper found Suho pinned near the estate's rear entrance, outnumbered, his own men fighting a losing exchange 20 feet away, Yuna herself standing calm and cold in the doorway behind him with a gun leveled at his back and an expression that had finally, mercifully, stopped pretending to be warm. You should have married me and stayed ignorant, Yuna said, her voice carrying none of the practiced sweetness from the introduction dinner. It would have been so much easier for both of us. Easier for you, Suho said, not turning, his own weapon steady in his hand but angled away from her, calculating the exact geometry of the standoff with a precision that Harper recognized even in that terrifying moment as entirely, achingly him. Harper did not think about what she did next so much as she simply did it, moving along the estate's rear wall out of Yuna's sight line, circling wide through the garden shadows with her pulse roaring in her ears, until she was close enough to close the final distance in 3 fast strides and slam her entire weight into Yuna's gun arm from the side, driving the weapon upward as it fired into the ceiling instead of into Suho's back. And Yuna spun toward her with a snarl that had nothing composed left in it, and the two of them grappled hard against the doorframe until Suho turned and ended it with a single motion that Harper did not fully process until it was already over, and Yuna went down and did not get up, and the estate fell into the particular ringing silence that follows violence when it finally stops. Suho reached Harper in 2 strides, his hands finding her face, checking her with the same desperate thoroughness as the parking structure, and this time he did not step back afterward, did not let the mask return. He simply held her there against him in the wreckage of what had almost been his wedding, breathing hard, saying her name like it was the only word he had left. You were supposed to stay home, he said into her hair. I've never once done what you wanted to hear, Harper said, and felt him laugh, low and startled and real, against the top of her head. The weeks that followed the estate confrontation reshaped the Los Angeles corridor entirely. The Choi alliance dissolved in the wreckage of Yuna's exposure. The rival faction that had planted her scattered and weakened by the loss of an operation 18 months in the making, and Suho's empire, rather than fracturing under the strain of a broken engagement and an assassination attempt, emerged from it steadier than before, because every soldier in the organization now understood exactly what kind of loyalty Harper Doyle had proven herself capable of, and exactly what kind of place she now occupied at Suho's side. Not hidden anymore, not a careful professional distance maintained for anyone's comfort, but present, visible, acknowledged. There was a cost, of course, because Suho had told her once that nothing in his world came free, and the cost arrived in the form of Harper's own hands, steady for 4 years, developing a slight tremor she could not fully control for weeks afterward, a small persistent reminder of the paperweight and the jewelry box and the garden shadows. A body's honest accounting of everything her mind had refused to feel in the moments when feeling it would have gotten her killed. Suho noticed, the way he noticed everything about her now, and he never once suggested she should have stayed home, never once treated the tremor as something to be fixed or hidden. He simply took her hand in his whenever he saw it start, steady and certain, and let his stillness do for her what it had always done for everyone else in his orbit, until slowly, over weeks, her hands remembered how to be still too. On the evening the tremor finally stopped for good, Harper stood at the window of Suho's office, the same window she had stood beside for 4 years, bringing him coffee at exactly the temperature he wanted it, and she watched the Koreatown skyline settle into its evening lights, and she felt him come up behind her, his hand finding hers, steady now. Both of them. For years I stood behind that desk telling myself this was enough, Harper said quietly. Being close to you. Being useful to you. I told myself I didn't need anything more than that. Were you lying? Suho asked. Every single day, Harper said, and turned to face him, and found him already looking at her with an expression that held nothing back anymore, no calculation, no distance, nothing but the specific, unmistakable certainty of a man who had finally stopped protecting himself from the one thing in his empire he could not control. What about you? She asked. 4 years of watching me stand right there. Were you lying too? Every single day, Suho said, and did not look away. Downstairs, the building had already begun settling into the particular hush that came after the soldiers finished their evening rounds, footsteps fading down the stairwells, the low murmur of the night shift taking over the front desk, all of it distant and familiar and, for the first time in 4 years, entirely unremarkable to Harper, because she was no longer standing at that window listening for the sound of his door the way she used to, straining for any sign of what mood he carried home. With him, any signal she could use to calibrate exactly how close she was allowed to stand. She did not have to calibrate anything anymore. His hand was simply in hers, steady, and that was the whole of it, no negotiation required. Priya asked me once if I'd spent 4 years telling myself a story, Harper said. Because the alternative was admitting I'd wasted that time on something that was never going to happen. What did you tell her? Nothing, Harper said. I didn't have an answer yet. Do you have one now? Harper considered the window, the skyline, the hand in hers that had stopped shaking days ago and did not look like it intended to start again. It wasn't a story, she said. It was just early. Suho did not answer that with words. He simply drew her hand up, pressed it once against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat steady beneath her palm, and held it there, and Harper understood that this, not a ring, not a ceremony, not anything the world outside that window would ever be permitted to witness, was the truest vow either of them would ever make.